Beyond Science, Conversations with Arthur M. Young. Interviewer Charles Fauvre discusses issues of science and consciousness with Arthur Young, honored inventor of the Bell helicopter, philosopher, and author of The Reflexive Universe. Today, an introduction to Metascience, a glimpse past the limits of scientific inquiry.
Hello. Arthur, you've often said that you'd like to expand the boundaries of science to include such aspects as purpose and value, things which are currently considered to be outside the scope of science. I'd like to know what you consider to be the limits of science and the limits of knowledge that are attainable through scientific method.
Yes, it's a subject that certainly deserves clarification, because right away you're confronted with the fact that science is dealing with things it can manipulate in laboratories, small animals, germs, things they put in test tubes. You can't take mediums and put them in test tubes. Now that is involved in the question of what is the function of science. And for the most part, science has to deal with things less than ourselves, things we can manipulate and apply in whatever way we want to use them. I mean, if we want to make atom bombs, that is not in the scope of science to say what we do with them. It's how we make them. But then there's another sense in which science does go beyond those limits in dealing with first causes, in dealing with things such as you mentioned, purpose. That's asking the big question, why? And science is not structured for that. Yes. But they inevitably get into it because when you probe deeply, you get into fundamentals, first causes. So part of the reform that I think is called for is, to equip science to deal with first causes. But this means a drastic change in its current policy. For example, if the scientist has to claim or insist that everything is objective, it can't deal with purpose because purpose is not objective.
Yes.
So we have that problem.
That's a problem.
But then there's also the problem that people are involved. In fact, that's the core of the thing. Science isn't more important than people. People are more important than science. Mm-hmm. So then it comes to the question of relationships which are not on that basis that science is dealing with. Relations of person to person, and beyond that, our relation to what's beyond ourselves. Now you could say, well, that sounds like God and all that, and that's obsolete now. Well, it isn't really obsolete. What might be obsolete is some particular concept of God, like the idea of an old man with a long gray beard and so on. But certainly there has to be something beyond ourselves. That's the whole spirit of evolution. It's an ongoing process of development and life surpassing itself.
Let me ask you, when you say beyond ourselves, how are you using the word self there? Do you mean beyond the physical, the objectively knowable, into transpersonal realms, or beyond that?
The transpersonal and beyond that, but I mean also not just as a goal, but we know there are geniuses, there's people out of the ordinary, and we don't even know that they need be in physical bodies. In fact, by my theory, they're not. The highest development of man would be outside of physical bodies. But we need to sort of look carefully into science, and without imposing anything upon science, because science has to do its thing in its own way, find what there is in science that indicates this superior realm. Higher worlds, you could even call it. And I think one of the most interesting is the higher world, what the ancients used to call the intelligible world, as distinct from the sensible world. And this world was outside of space and time. Now, science can no longer say this is an impossibility, because some of the current scientific experiments are forcing them to recognize the existence of this realm.
What sort of experiments are you referring to?
I'm referring to the one that's known as the EPR experiment. EPR stands for Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen. And a long time ago, before Einstein died, they proposed this thought experiment, they call it, of two photons created at the same source, going in opposite directions. And it was proposed to show up the fallacy of quantum physics, because they said if quantum physics was correct, then these two photons would remain in touch with each other. And if you did an experiment on one, you could find out about the other. It was intended to show that quantum theory was ridiculous.
I see.
But then, fairly recently, 3 or 4 years ago, someone thought they'd try the experiment. They expected it to confirm Einstein. But they found, to their surprise, that this experiment indicated that if one photon was measured, the other photon was determined. In other words, you could tell what they were interrelated. They were locked together. And the first explanation seemed absurd. There had to be signals passing from one to the other at greater than the speed of light. But they've come around now to realize that there is no time at the level of photons, and therefore they remain in time. There's no space either. So they remain a unity, even though they're two photons going in opposite directions. Now, that puts it on the line. Science has to recognize the existence of this higher realm. And I'd like to quote from my book, a quote from St. Basil. Now, remember I said that light was outside of time.
Yes.
Well, I want to read this quote from 370 A.D.
Okay.
It follows, says St. Basil, that light is of a more general nature than time, for time is found only in the sensible world. That's the world of matter. Because light is not limited to time, it was universally distributed at the moment of its creation, as it fills the whole room in which a lamp is kindled. Between the intelligible and sensible world, the firmament acts as a barrier, of which the solidity implied by its nature is such that light may pass through it, but time cannot break into the world above.
I see.
Now here is a philosopher, 370 A.D., saying things that were only possible after after Einstein, and only recognized as necessary today. This world of light in which there is no time. Another way this is coming to focus is in recognition of precognition. And there's a very current danger now, and I've heard it from several scientists, they say, oh yes, we can accept precognition. We prefer it that way because the equations of physics go either way.
Yes.
Now, to say that is to miss the point. It's not because time goes either way that we can have precognition. It's because we're outside of time. And if I were to ask you, well, now, can you imagine yourself in New York?
Yes.
Can you imagine yourself being in San Francisco?
Yes.
In Paris?
Yes.
Well, our mind is free. Now you could say, oh, well, that's just imagination. But hold on a minute, because now they're finding that distant viewing, you can actually see what's going on in places, things that you don't know. So there is that capability within us to be in this realm that's outside of time. And outside space, I should say, with regard to the previewing, distant viewing, I mean. Well, this gives some indication of what I'm talking about by these higher worlds.
Arthur, at what point in our own development do we enter these higher realms of life, drop the body, this sort of thing?
Well, I wouldn't say drop the body because we can just have distant viewing and all these things within the body.
All right.
But we do have access to them at any time.
Mm-hmm.
And those times are very important. They are referred to in religion as times of revelation, or actually I'd like to say that's the real meaning of the virgin birth. When you realize your goal, you're caught in the grocery store, and you remember what you came for. You cease to be distracted by all these goodies and, oh yes, butter, eggs, but there is a contact with your original purpose. You go back to the higher world and remember what you came for. That's putting it in a humble way. But the point is that these higher worlds are very important, especially to our evolution further. And now they're coming to be important in science. And it's bringing out this crisis in science. What is science about? Is it about the physical world, things you can manipulate, or is it about first causes? And it tries to do both, and it can't do so because it's not equipped to deal with first causes. So there's a critical thing going on now.
Well, what does science have to do? I'm sorry, I cut you off about the critical thing that's going on.
Well, I'm watching to see. Science has shut its eyes and ears to these new experiments about parapsychology, but it's beginning to have to recognize them. What's going to happen? Will this recognition be something like the recognition of hypnosis, which is now put in a sort of sub-department of medicine? There's no attempt to understand hypnosis. It would blow the current paradigm to pieces if you really got to the bottom of it.
Really?
So what I'm worried about is some think that science and the lion and the lamb can lie down together, have peace on all sides.
Yes.
But what I think that would be not the right thing, because we've already got science accepting things like hypnosis, which if examined would undermine the basis of science. We need to undermine this basis and get down to the bottom of things and get a better foundation on which to build.
Well, that's a typical human way to deal with something you don't want to deal with. It is to bring it under your control and assign it to a place in the basement. Right? So what would you like to see science do about these phenomena?
Well, I would like to see them, first of all, meet the challenge on the theoretical level. this does not seem to be popular, and it's partly due to the way the growth in science has occurred with fragmentation to many, many departments, and people don't cross departmental lines.
Yes.
They just examine more facts, and this is a popular thing because you can have many mud puddles with
Yes.
many frogs
Yes.
ruling them.
I wonder if you might talk about the things that science can't handle and that it denies entirely, and some of your interests in those things.
Well, I mentioned that I was afraid that science would just accept them without further examination, just have another department, another sign up saying parapsychology here, and don't bother us, and so on. That would deprive science of its chance to really get into first cause.
Yes, it would.
So it's to science's interest, too. I really need, though, to get away from this battle question, this really political issues,
Yes.
science versus non-science, and get to the challenge, put the challenge to man himself.
I am very interested in the mysteries beyond science, for example. And I know you yourself have an interest in astrology, and I'd like to know something about that.
What I found about astrology is that it provides a scenario for a person's life that forces them to go beyond what they think of as their own capabilities. Now this is, fate has a bad name because it's supposed to interfere with your free will. But I think it's the other way around. The free will is a relatively timid thing. You use it to drive cars or walk around the room. You don't use it to select great goals. So you need some prodding. And this prodding is supplied by the what's called astrology. Actually, it has to do with periodic changes in the zeitgeist.
The
You know
zeitgeist.
what I mean by the zeitgeist?
I'm not sure I do.
Well,
in fact, I'm sure I don't.
The spirit of the times.
The spirit of the times. Okay.
Now, that changes, just the way the tides change. Marine life is very responsive to the tides, the little shellfish and so on. And vegetable life is very, very, very responsive to the sun, the seasons. If you plant things, they grow. If you plant them at the right time of year, they won't grow if you plant them in the wrong time of year. So there's a zeitgeist for plants. And there's a zeitgeist for persons that is beyond the scope of animals, because most of the important planets have a period greater than the life of an ordinary animal. Say a horse or a dog could live to 15 or 20 years.
Yeah.
But Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, these important planets, all have periods longer than 20 years. And I think the best argument for astrology is that out of all the periods the planets could possibly have, from 10 to the minus 22 seconds to 4 billion years, they are precisely the right length for creatures with a lifespan, anticipated lifespan of, say, 80 years.
Is that right?
And in fact, their meanings can be defined in terms of their period. Uranus, which is the planet of self-conscious ego, self-determination, and it was discovered at the time that self-determination was discovered in social terms. Do you remember the date?
I don't.
Well, the Declaration of Independence.
Okay.
We believe that every man has the right to determine himself.
All right.
That was 1776, and it was about that time that Uranus was discovered. And it's the planet of self-determination. Its period is 84 years, which is just about a healthy lifespan. And it's the most you can encompass in a complete lifespan.
I see.
And hence it stands for the ego, the things that you feel you can do. Within that is Saturn, which moves at 29 years. Now, I don't want to get into too much detail on the astrology. I just want to say that it's exactly set up for stimulating man to do more than he would do ordinarily.
Yes. So it does have a really marked physical effect upon man as well as plants and animals.
Yes. When you say physical, I have to be a little careful there because so far there's been no way to detect it.
No way to measure it, you mean?
To measure it. I don't think it is physical. This is another area where this question of higher worlds has to be introduced. And these higher worlds may even have different time rates. This is part of the things I'm studying now, and I haven't come to the answer. But the horizons that are opening up are altogether very exciting and altogether new.
What sort of effect, if it's not physical, would you say that the planets and stars do have on man?
Well, I would rather put it in some other terminology than that of cause and effect. You see, this is part of, you don't claim to be a scientist, but you're thinking in terms of cause and effect, which is part of the scientific paradigm.
What phenomena might they observe then? Could we put it that way? Or feel?
I'd rather put it in a different way altogether, that the solar system is an organon, an organized entity that has, shall we say, a grain. Well, the piece of wood has a grain, but I mean something more complicated than that. It has I don't want to say a pattern, but maybe that'll do. And that pattern changes as the planet moves, the pattern changes. When you are born, you have an imprint of the pattern of the universe at that moment. So what's happening is that this moving pattern is playing against the fixed pattern that came about when you were born. And the interaction between the two causes the conflicts, the successes, the critical times that you experience in your life. Otherwise, if there weren't this outer thing, there would be a terrific monotony in life.
Right. Indeed. It's a sort of as those two forces can create an interference pattern that is the stuff of life.
Right.
I certainly don't want to take that to a holographic simile, however.
Well, I can't get any mileage out of the holographic
I know.
simile.
That's why I don't want to do it.
But have I made that clear now, that there's an interaction between the universe as it is now, changing all the time, and as it was at the moment of your birth, and that interaction you are witness to. You are, you could say, oh, well, it all happened anyway, why bother, I don't need to be here. No, you're very important to that. There has to be somebody listening to the music, you see, or feeling this thing. It's not just listening, it's not observing. You are being ground by this machinery. You're being pulverized and refined, and this is your consciousness. So that out of this mill of the universe, we're grinding this substance called consciousness.
Do you feel that we will eventually become more attuned to these forces that are playing through us?
More attuned. This is again part of a different paradigm. We're not other than. We are that interaction.
maybe I should say more aware of what's happening.
Yeah, but you're separating the thing that you're aware of from the person that's aware of it, you see. It's through this process that our awareness develops. I mean, take something
so
like...
you're saying I shouldn't be reductionistic.
I think maybe I'm being unfair with you, but it sounds to me like reductionism.
Yes.
But naturally, that's the way to think until you have some other way.
Right.
And that's again where I'm asking science to move up a pace to provide us with better.
I think that's a wonderful
paradigm.
example of it.
Right.
I do wonder if you might compare astrology to hard science for us.
Oh, well, I have my favorite comparison there, which makes that contrast very sharp. A scientist, you remember, that wants the repeatable experiment.
Yes.
So you do the same experiment over again, you expect the same result. Astrology is just the opposite. You can never do the same experiment according to science, according to astrology, because the zeitgeist is changing. So what you can do is do different experiments at the same time and get the same result. In other words, you look at the tea leaves and look at your life, and they both have the same indications. Or you look at the chart, and whether this is a ship that's launched or a business project or a new baby, it will have the same outcome. That doesn't mean literally the same, but there will be a time when such and such a kind of crisis occurs, and so forth and so on. But you can predict the result by this hocus pocus of setting up the chart. That's in the ideal. But in practice, you can never get the details filled in, and that's why it's important to live it.
All right. We've just about run out of time here, Arthur, and on that wonderful comment I want to end, and thank you again for being with us today.